So Chris, you have 7.5 minutes.
7.5 minutes.
Go ahead and begin as you're ready.
All right. Doug, I gotta tell you, I love you. And to answer some of your questions that you didn't bring up, since I have 7.5 minutes, anything I want to talk about, I think it's important to point out that in a conversation that it's perfectly within the realm of a good conversation to ask for clarification. And there was no malicious intent on my part in using the words of empiricism and then importing them into historicity. I appreciate the clarification on your part. That being said, though, empirical data is observed data. And ultimately, historical data, especially eyewitness data, is still within the realm of observational data. So it's not a stretch to use the words of empirical data in talking about historical observation, especially when we're dealing with eyewitness testimony. And so there was no malicious intent to deceive on my part. And so I wanted to make that point clear. As we come back to the issue, again, the question that still is really on the table is based upon the evidence of the eyewitnesses. What has been said by Matthew, by Mark, by Luke, by John, regarding the future judgment. And then how that judgment was understood by Paul, how that judgment was understood by Peter, how it was understood by John, and then how that later got translated into the understanding of the church as they taught about this. I think it's beyond the limits of credulity to basically say that every time we talk about judgment, from Jesus to Peter to Paul to Irenaeus to Tertullian to Ignatius, that every single time we're discussing judgment, we have to be speaking, not that there is no such thing as a literal judgment. There will not be people who spend an eternity under God's eternal conscious punishment. Yet, the natural understanding of the words that are used, the pictures that are painted, and are consistently taught by Jesus, the apostles, and their disciples, point to a literal judgment where the unrighteous, those who are not believers, spend an eternity in God's eternal conscious torment. It is described by Jesus as the Gehenna of fire, the fiery furnace. It's described in other ways, eternal destruction. That being the case, that we have to come back. What is the best explanation? What has best explanatory power in light of these documents and the evidence that's presented by these eyewitnesses? It would be all too easy to just say, I dislike the picture that's being painted, so I'm going to create some kind of a game where I can say this is metaphorical and it has to be. We're talking about something bigger than all of this, and what Jesus is really saying is that everybody is going to shine like the sun, yet nothing in the text dictates or even would warrant such a wild interpretation. What was the point of Jesus talking about the unrighteous being thrown into a fiery furnace? So, it basically using, I need some kind of postmodern decoder ring or some kind of postmodern spectacles that I can, every time I take a look at a text, it'll alert me to where I can say, no, there's no such thing as conscious torment, and that everybody is in. And yet, in fact, the reality is that I don't see any passages whatsoever in Scripture that would argue against the picture that Jesus makes. Jesus speaking plainly, enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to it, and those who find it are few. Why would he be talking in language like this when it would be, if he intended to say, listen, got you all covered, everybody's in, he should be saying, listen, the highway in is huge, everybody's on it, let's party. And yet he doesn't argue like that at all. Over and again, there's a dichotomy made between the righteous and the unrighteous, the saved and the unsaved, those who believe and those who refuse to believe, those who pervert the truth and those who tell the truth. And for those who are in the unrighteous, non-truth tellers who make things up and blaspheme the name of God and cause people to sin, over and again, the Scriptures paint the pictures of those who suffer God's wrath and eternal punishment, and recompensed for their wicked deeds. And all so tragically, because at the end of Matthew 25, Jesus makes it clear that those who depart into the eternal fire, it wasn't prepared for man, it was created for the devil and the angels. The other thing I thought was interesting is that Doug talked about the KJV, and I'm not sure how that even got brought up. I don't read the KJV. Do y'all know what we use? We're not a Baptist church, are we? No, I don't use the KJV, and I wasn't arguing from the KJV. And not only that, you made reference points to the Old Testament, and not a single one of my arguments rested on the Old Testament. Instead, the argument is simple. Jesus talked this way. When he was speaking in metaphorical language, he interpreted. The interpretation gives us a way to properly understand and orient ourselves with the parable, and that literal interpretation then is carried on by the disciples and on into the church. And the data is there in the text, it's there in the writings of the apostles, and it's there in the writings of the apostolic fathers, and it's consistent. It's a consistent line. In fact, this was also not even remotely disputed during the time of the Reformation between the Lutheran, the Calvinist, and the Catholics. They all agreed that the Scriptures clearly teach that there's a coming judgment. And, if this was really up for dispute, this hasn't really been disputed until the rise of modernist liberalism.
Thank you, Doug, for your